Jake Morrison prided himself on being the kind of pilot who could navigate asteroid fields with his eyes closed and land a cargo hauler in spaces that technically shouldn't fit anything larger than a sandwich. This confidence in his abilities was why he decided to take what his navigation computer cheerfully described as a minor detour through the Serafina system, despite the fact that his autopilot had been making suspicious clicking sounds for the past 3 days. The clicking sounds, it turned out, had been the mechanical equivalent of a death rattle. Warning, navigation system failure, his ship's computer announced with the helpful timing of someone mentioning an umbrella during a thunderstorm. Recommend immediate emergency landing procedures. Jake stared at his instrument panel, which was now displaying error messages in 6 different languages, including 2 he was fairly certain were extinct. Through his viewport, the resort moon of Serafina Prime gleamed like a jewel against the star field, its carefully maintained atmosphere shimmering with the kind of artificial perfection that suggested very expensive terraforming. Define, immediate, he muttered, wrestling with controls that seemed determined to interpret every command as a suggestion rather than an order. Immediate, within the next 47 seconds, assuming current rate of orbital decay. The landing was less a controlled descent and more a barely managed catastrophe. Jake's cargo hauler, the Wandering Star, hit the moon's surface with enough force to rearrange the local landscape and send several species of decorative birds fleeing in formations that suggested they'd been through this before. When the dust settled and his ears stopped ringing, Jake found himself in what appeared to be a meticulously maintained garden paradise. Crystalline spires rose from beds of flowers that seemed to generate their own soft light, while streams of water that definitely shouldn't exist in this gravitational field flowed uphill in patterns that hurt to contemplate. The air smelled like jasmine and ozone and something that reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen, if his grandmother had been an alien botanist with access to impossible chemistry. Well, Jake said to his unresponsive navigation computer, this could be worse. That was when the security drones arrived. 3 sleek, elegant machines that looked more like abstract art pieces than enforcement tools descended from the spires, their scanning beams playing over Jake and his ship with mechanical curiosity. He raised his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent, though given his luck with interspecies communication, it probably meant something like, please examine my digestive system, in whatever language the drones were programmed for. Identity confirmed, human male, formal attire protocols initialized, announced the lead drone in a voice that sounded like wind chimes having a philosophical discussion. Welcome to the Celestial Gardens. Please proceed to ceremony preparation area. Jake looked down at his oil-stained coveralls and steel-toed boots. I think there's been a mistake. This isn't formal attire, this is exotic human ceremonial garments noted and approved. Cultural diversity protocols engaged. Please follow designated path to avoid disruption of sacred proceedings. Before Jake could explain that his exotic human ceremonial garments were what he wore to fix leaking fuel lines, the drones had surrounded him with gentle but irresistible force fields that propelled him toward what looked like a palace made of crystallized music and crystallized light. The path wound through gardens that defied at least 3 laws of physics Jake was aware of and probably several more he'd never studied. Flowers sang in harmonious whispers, trees grew in perfect spirals that somehow looked natural, and the ground beneath his feet felt like walking on solidified starlight. It was the kind of place that charged by the hour for the privilege of existing in its presence. This is definitely worse, Jake mumbled as he was guided through an archway that shimmered like a soap bubble made of aurora borealis. The interior of the Celestial Gardens was even more overwhelming than the exterior. The main hall stretched upward into what might have been a dome or might have been a window into hyperspace. Jake's eyes couldn't quite decide which interpretation made more sense. Hundreds of beings from dozens of different worlds filled terraced seating areas that seemed to grow organically from the walls themselves. There were tall, graceful beings that looked like they'd been carved from living crystal, their faceted skin catching and reflecting light in patterns that suggested they were conducting conversations through controlled refraction. Plant-like entities rustled with leaves that shifted through color spectrums Jake didn't have names for, while gaseous beings maintained roughly humanoid shapes through what appeared to be force of will and good manners. And they were all dressed for the most formal occasion Jake could imagine. The crystalline beings wore intricate formations of precious metals that seemed to grow from their skin like elaborate jewelry that had achieved sentience. The plant entities had cultivated flowers and vines into clothing that bloomed and shifted with their movements. Even the gaseous beings had managed to incorporate what looked like controlled lightning into their semi-solid forms. Jake, in his maintenance coveralls, felt approximately as formal as a wrench at a poetry reading. "Distinguished guest," whispered one of the escort drones, "please take your assigned seating in Section Tau Prime. The ceremony will commence shortly." Section Tau Prime turned out to be a semicircular arrangement of what looked like grown furniture positioned with perfect views of a raised platform where two elaborate thrones faced each other across a space filled with floating musical instruments that played themselves. Jake settled onto what he hoped was a chair and tried to look like someone who belonged at whatever was about to happen. The being seated to his left resembled a cross between a hummingbird and a geometric theorem, its crystalline wings creating small rainbows as it moved. The entity to his right appeared to be made of controlled plasma held together by Baroque silver filigree, and kept making sounds like distant thunder whenever it shifted position. "Greetings, honored delegate," said the plasma being in a voice like wine through cathedral bells. "We have not had the pleasure of your acquaintance. I am Scholar Resonance of Distant Stars. What clan do you represent in today's unification ceremony?" Jake's mind went completely blank. The Morrison clan." "Morrison," repeated Scholar Resonance thoughtfully. "Ah yes, the human mercantile dynasty. Your reputation for efficient resource distribution precedes you. How delightful that your people chose to honor this occasion with a representative." "Right," Jake managed. "Efficient, resource distribution. That's us." The crystalline being on his other side chimed in with sounds like breaking glass arranged into language. "The Morrison delegate's ceremonial attire is most intriguing. Such practical elegance speaks to your species' philosophical approach to formal occasions." Jake looked down at his coveralls again, wondering if he'd accidentally stumbled into a parallel universe where oil stains were considered high fashion. "The ceremony begins," announced a voice that seemed to come from the air itself, and the assembled crowd fell into respectful silence. Two figures emerged onto the central platform, and Jake realized he was witnessing something historically significant even if he had no idea what it was. The first figure was clearly one of the crystalline beings, but larger and more elaborate than any Jake had seen, with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living mathematics. The second was definitely plant-based, but had achieved a complexity of form that suggested centuries of careful cultivation, with flowers and leaves arranged in configurations that hurt to look at directly. "Today," the voice continued, "House Zephyr and House Verdania unite their bloodlines in eternal harmony, symbolizing the cooperation between the Crystalline Confederacy and the Garden Worlds Alliance." Jake felt his stomach sink as he realized he'd accidentally crashed the wedding of the century. Around him, beings from across the galaxy watched with reverent attention as the two houses prepared to formalize an alliance that would reshape interstellar politics. And he was trapped in the middle of it, wearing coveralls and pretending to be a representative of the apparently famous Morrison clan, with no idea how to escape without causing the kind of diplomatic incident that started wars. The ceremonial music began, if music was the right word for sounds that seemed to come from instruments that existed in dimensions Jake couldn't perceive, and he settled in for what was clearly going to be a very long, very complicated evening. The wedding ceremony, Jake discovered, was less like anything he'd experienced on Earth and more like watching a live performance of theoretical physics set to music that existed in colors. The crystalline groom had begun emitting harmonic frequencies that made Jake's teeth itch, while the plant-based bride responded with light displays that seemed to involve photosynthesis as a form of interpretive dance. Around him, the alien guests participated with responses that ranged from synchronized crystalline chiming to what appeared to be competitive levitation. Jake tried to blend in by nodding appreciatively at appropriate moments, though he suspected his timing was off when the plasma being beside him whispered, "Your species' restraint during the fertility blessing is admirably dignified." "We're very dignified," Jake agreed, having no idea what he'd just missed and fairly certain he didn't want to know. The ceremony involved several stages that seemed designed to test Jake's ability to look knowledgeable about things he'd never imagined. There was the harmonic convergence, during which crystalline guests produced tones that made the air itself visible. The photosynthetic proclamation required all plant-based attendees to bloom simultaneously, filling the hall with fragrances that existed somewhere between perfume and mathematics. And the dimensional witnessing involved gaseous beings temporarily merging into a collective consciousness that spoke in unison about the cosmic significance of unity. Jake's contribution to each stage was limited to trying not to look completely lost, a strategy that apparently passed for sophisticated philosophical contemplation among his fellow guests. The Morrison representative's meditative approach to the proceedings is most enlightening, observed the crystalline being to his left. Your people's wisdom in observing before participating shows deep respect for interspecies harmony. That's, yes. We believe in careful observation, Jake said, mentally filing away the fact that looking confused apparently counted as wisdom in alien social circles. The situation became more complicated when the ceremony reached what the officiant announced as the interactive blessing phase, during which guests were expected to contribute personal gifts of energy, light, sound, or emotional resonance to the newly united couple. Jake watched in growing panic as beings around him produced offerings that ranged from controlled lightning to what appeared to be crystallized music to several things that violated the conservation of energy. When attention turned to him, Jake did the only thing he could think of. He reached into his coverall pocket and pulled out his emergency ration bar. From the Morrison clan, he announced, hoping desperation sounded like ceremony, we offer concentrated human nutritional energy. For strength in your union. The hall fell silent for a moment, and Jake was certain he'd just committed the galactic equivalent of bringing a hot dog to a formal dinner. Then the plant bride's leaves rustled with what sounded like delighted laughter. How wonderfully practical, she said in a voice like wind through wheat fields. To offer sustenance rather than spectacle shows deep understanding of what truly nourishes a partnership. The crystalline groom chimed in agreement, his harmonic frequencies shifting to what Jake hoped were pleased tones. The Morrison delegation honors us with wisdom disguised as simplicity. Jake accepted the praise with what he hoped looked like humble dignity rather than sheer relief, and settled back as the ceremony continued with increasingly elaborate rituals that seemed designed by a committee of quantum physicists and interpretive dancers. It was during the ethereal binding ritual, which involved floating geometric patterns and music that tasted like starlight, that Jake noticed he was being watched. Not the casual observation he'd been receiving from curious guests, but focused, intense scrutiny from someone who seemed more interested in him than in the cosmic wedding unfolding before them. Following the sensation led his gaze to a section of seating reserved for beings whose formal attire suggested even more exclusive social status than the already impressive gathering around him. She was striking in a way that made Jake's breath catch, with the kind of elegant bone structure that suggested either excellent genetics or several centuries of refined living. Her skin was pale as starlight, her hair dark as the space between stars, and when she smiled, which she was doing while looking directly at him, Jake could see the delicate points of canine teeth that marked her as sanguinari. Jake's knowledge of sanguinari culture was limited to transport pilot gossip and commercial media, but he knew enough to recognize that they were among the galaxy's oldest spacefaring civilizations, with social hierarchies more complex than most planetary governments and personal lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades. They were also, if the stories were true, consummate predators with enhanced senses and an appreciation for interesting challenges. The fact that one of them was watching him with obvious amusement was probably not a good sign. She was dressed in what looked like liquid shadow woven with silver starlight, her formal attire managing to be both elegant and subtly predatory. Her posture suggested complete confidence in her own superiority, but her expression carried something that looked dangerously like curiosity. When their eyes met across the ceremony hall, she raised one perfectly manicured hand in a gesture that was either a greeting or a claim of ownership. Jake couldn't tell which, and wasn't sure he wanted to know the difference. The ceremony concluded with a spectacular display that involved the temporary merging of all guests' various forms of energy into a collective celebration that lit up the hall like a controlled supernova. Jake contributed by trying not to panic, which apparently counted as grounding human presence, according to the being beside him who could detect emotional states through electromagnetic resonance. As the formal proceedings ended and guests began moving toward what looked like reception areas, Jake's escape route was immediately blocked by enthusiastic aliens who seemed determined to engage the mysterious Morrison representative in detailed conversations about human customs, interstellar trade policies, and his opinions on the cosmic significance of the unity they'd just witnessed. "Delegate Morrison," chimed the crystalline being who'd been sitting beside him, "you must join our discussion circle. Your perspective on cross-species resource sharing would be invaluable." "Actually, I should probably," Jake began, but was immediately interrupted by the plasma being who seemed to have appointed himself as Jake's cultural interpreter. "Nonsense. The Morrison clan's reputation for diplomatic insight is legendary. We insist you share your wisdom with our colleagues from the Spiral Arm Trading Consortium." Jake found himself swept into a gathering of aliens whose combined wealth probably exceeded the gross domestic product of most solar systems, all of whom seemed convinced that he possessed profound insights into subjects he'd never heard of. His strategy of nodding thoughtfully and making non-committal sounds about interesting perspectives and complex considerations somehow passed for brilliant diplomatic commentary. It was during his third improvised lecture on human approaches to resource optimization that he noticed the sanguinary woman had moved closer, now standing at the edge of the group with an expression that suggested she was enjoying a private joke. When their eyes met again, she smiled, an expression that was both invitation and challenge, and Jake realized that his evening was about to become significantly more complicated. The reception, he was beginning to understand, was just getting started. The reception hall defied several architectural principles Jake was fairly certain were supposed to be universal constants. Crystalline formations grew from the floor like musical instruments, each one producing different harmonics when touched by the various guests who seemed to know exactly which frequencies would create pleasing melodies. Floating platforms drifted through the space at various levels, carrying refreshment stations that offered everything from liquid starlight to what appeared to be crystallized time. Jake had positioned himself near what he hoped was a wall, though it kept shifting between solid matter and decorative light display, making it an unreliable source of support. His strategy of observing rather than participating was working well until the music started and he realized that alien wedding receptions involved dancing that occurred in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The crystalline beings performed aerial ballet that involved temporarily becoming pure light and reforming in complex geometric patterns. Plant entities engaged in interpretive growth displays that somehow counted as choreography, their leaves and flowers shifting through seasonal cycles in rhythm with music that tasted like different colors. The gaseous beings had formed a collective dance troupe that moved like controlled weather systems, creating formations that resembled everything from spiral galaxies to abstract mathematical concepts. "Impressive, isn't it?" said a voice behind him that carried the kind of accent that suggested centuries of practice at being elegantly dangerous. Jake turned to find the sanguinary woman standing close enough that he could detect the subtle scent of her perfume, something that reminded him of night-blooming flowers and winter starlight. Up close, she was even more striking, with features that suggested both predatory grace and intellectual curiosity. "I'm sorry," Jake said, "I don't think we've been introduced. I'm Jake Morrison of the transport vessel Wandering Star, currently claiming to represent the Morrison clan in order to avoid explaining how you crashed your cargo hauler into the galaxy's most exclusive wedding venue," she said with a smile that revealed those delicately pointed canine teeth. "I'm Lady Valeria Nightshade of House Obsidian, and I've been wondering how long you plan to maintain this delightful charade." Jake's carefully constructed cover story crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. "You know, my dear human, I've known since the moment you stumbled into the ceremony hall. Sanguinari have excellent hearing, enhanced olfactory senses, and the ability to detect emotional states through biological markers. You've been projecting confusion, panic, and poorly suppressed terror for the past 2 hours. And you didn't expose me because..." Her laugh was like silver bells with an edge of midnight. "Because this is the most entertaining wedding I've attended in 3 decades. Watching you improvise explanations for human resource optimization strategies while clearly having no idea what resources were being discussed has been absolutely delightful." Jake felt heat rising in his cheeks. "So you've been enjoying my humiliation. I've been enjoying your creativity." Do you have any idea how refreshing it is to meet someone who's genuinely honest about being completely out of their depth? Most beings at gatherings like this spend their time pretending to knowledge they don't possess while scheming for political advantage. You're pretending to knowledge you don't possess while trying desperately not to cause interstellar incidents. It's charmingly authentic. I'm trapped here, Jake admitted. The security systems won't let me leave until the ceremony concludes. My ship is probably being impounded as we speak, and I'm going to be arrested for. I don't even know what this counts as. Interstellar party crashing. Diplomatic misrepresentation under false pretenses, Valeria supplied helpfully. Though given that you haven't actually misrepresented anything, you've been startlingly honest about your ignorance, the charges might be reduced to unlawful presence at a restricted cultural event. That's not better. No, it's not. She gestured toward the dancing couples with elegant grace. Which is why I'm going to offer you a solution that will either save your reputation or destroy it completely. Jake watched a group of crystalline beings perform what looked like controlled nuclear fusion as a dance routine. I'm listening. Sanguinari social customs around dancing are quite specific. When a member of our species invites someone to dance at a formal gathering, it represents a public declaration of interest, professional, personal, or political. The invitation itself carries significant social weight. Meaning that if I were to invite you to dance, it would signal to everyone present that House Obsidian considers you worthy of formal attention. It would transform you from a suspicious party crasher into my personal guest, with all the diplomatic protections that entails. Jake looked at the dance floor, where couples were performing maneuvers that appeared to violate conservation of momentum. What's the catch? The catch is that accepting such an invitation would make a very public statement about our association. Sanguinari don't extend social courtesies casually, and everyone here knows that. Your acceptance would be interpreted as evidence of some significant connection between us. What kind of connection? Valeria's smile was mysterious and slightly predatory. That would depend entirely on how well you dance. I should mention that my dancing experience is limited to avoiding cargo containers that broke loose during transport. And I wasn't very good at that. I suspected as much. Which is why this will be either spectacular entertainment or a complete disaster. Possibly both. The music shifted to something that sounded like cosmic wind chimes conducting a philosophical debate, and several couples moved onto the dance floor to perform what looked like interpretive quantum mechanics. Why would you help me? Jake asked. You said yourself that this is entertaining. Why not just watch me continue to fumble around until security figures out I don't belong here? Because, Valeria said, extending one pale, elegantly gloved hand, I haven't had a genuine challenge in decades. Most beings approach me with either terror or calculated political motivation. You're the first person I've met in years who's too panicked to have an agenda. I'm not sure that's a compliment. It's the highest compliment I can offer. So, Jake Morrison, accidental wedding crasher and inadvertent diplomatic representative, will you dance with me? Jake looked at her outstretched hand, then at the alien couples performing choreography that seemed to require advanced degrees in theoretical physics, then back at Valeria's face with its expression of amused challenge. You realize this is probably going to end badly. I'm counting on it. The best adventures always do. Against every survival instinct he possessed, Jake took her hand. Her touch was cool and surprisingly gentle, with an underlying strength that suggested she could probably bench press a cargo container without breaking a sweat. One question, he said as she led him toward the dance floor. What happens if I step on your feet? I don't actually have feet, dear human. I'm wearing gravitational field generators that allow me to walk on any surface. But if you disrupt my balance significantly, I might accidentally phase through the floor and end up in the sub-basement. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. Ready? The music swelled around them, and Jake realized he was about to attempt alien ballroom dancing with a vampire aristocrat while wearing coveralls, in front of an audience of galactic nobility who thought he was a diplomatic representative. "This is definitely going to end badly," he muttered. "Marvelously badly," Valeria agreed, and led him into what was either a dance or a controlled gravitational anomaly. Jake couldn't tell which, but he was fairly certain it was about to become legendary. The moment Jake and Valeria stepped onto the dance floor, the music shifted to something that sounded like the aurora borealis having a conversation with deep space itself. Around them, the assembled alien nobility fell into expectant silence, their various forms of attention focused on the unprecedented pairing of a sanguinary aristocrat and a mysterious human representative. "Just follow my lead," Valeria murmured as they took their initial positions. "And try not to panic when we start defying gravity." "When we what now?" The music began in earnest, and Jake discovered that sanguinary dancing involved not just graceful movement but temporary alterations to local physics. Valeria rose effortlessly into the air, her gravitational field generators allowing her to move in 3 dimensions as easily as walking. She extended her hands to Jake, who found himself lifted by some invisible force until they were spinning slowly several feet above the dance floor. "This is not normal human dancing," Jake managed, trying to maintain some semblance of coordination while floating in midair. "Nothing about this evening has been normal for you," Valeria replied, guiding him through a series of movements that were part waltz, part aerial ballet, and part controlled flight. "Why start now?" Jake's contribution to their performance was primarily enthusiastic survival instincts and a determined effort not to crash into any of the other dancing couples. His technique was somewhere between flailing with purpose and interpretive panic, but somehow Valeria made it work, using her enhanced strength and perfect balance to compensate for his complete lack of zero-gravity dance training. "You're actually not terrible at this," she said as they executed what might have been a pirouette if pirouettes typically involved rotating around both horizontal and vertical axes simultaneously. "I'm mostly just trying not to die. Most good dancing involves risk management. You're doing fine." The other couples on the dance floor were performing feats that belonged in physics textbooks rather than wedding receptions. Crystalline beings were splitting into component-like patterns and reforming in synchronized sequences. Plant entities were growing and blooming in rapid-time choreography that traced complex mandala patterns through the air. Gaseous beings had formed interconnected weather systems that danced like living storm fronts. Jake and Valeria's performance was decidedly more modest, consisting primarily of Jake trying to maintain orientation while Valeria demonstrated that centuries of practice could make even amateur partners look graceful through sheer force of skill. "The audience seems interested," Jake observed, noticing that their dance had drawn more attention than some of the more spectacular performances around them. "They're fascinated," Valeria confirmed. "Most formal interspecies dancing involves careful protocols and predetermined patterns. What we're doing is pure improvisation based on mutual adaptation. It's either revolutionary or catastrophic, depending on your perspective. Which is it? Ask me when we land." The music built toward what sounded like a crescendo involving the birth and death of several stars, and Valeria guided them into a final sequence that required Jake to trust completely in her ability to control their movement through space. They spun in slowly tightening spirals, the gravitational fields around them creating visual distortions that turned them into a double helix of controlled motion. When they finally touched down on the dance floor, the hall erupted in a cacophony of alien applause that ranged from harmonic crystalline chiming to what sounded like controlled explosions of approval from the gaseous beings. "Well," said Scholar Resonance of Distant Stars, approaching with the rapid movement patterns that indicated high excitement, "that was unprecedented. The Morrison representative and Lady Nightshade have just performed the first recorded human sanguinary collaborative dance in diplomatic history." "Is that good?" Jake asked, still slightly dizzy from the gravitational field manipulation. "It's remarkable," chimed the crystalline being who'd been his ceremony companion. "Your species' approach to adaptive movement combined with sanguinary precision control created entirely new forms of spatial harmony. You've accidentally invented a fusion dance style." Valeria smiled with satisfaction that suggested she'd planned this outcome from the beginning. "Jake, I believe you're about to become much more famous than you anticipated." Before Jake could ask what she meant, the wedding's officiant, a being whose species Jake couldn't identify but whose authority was unmistakable. Approached with the measured pace of someone making an important announcement. The Unity celebration concludes with recognition of those who have contributed most significantly to the joy of this occasion, the officiant proclaimed in harmonics that made the air shimmer. House Zephyr and House Verdania wish to honor the Morrison representative and Lady Nightshade for demonstrating that true harmony emerges not from perfect technique, but from willingness to trust across differences. A floating platform descended from somewhere near the hall's impossible ceiling, carrying what appeared to be crystallized music in the form of an award that existed in too many dimensions to look at directly. "Oh no," Jake whispered. "Oh yes," Valeria replied, clearly delighted by his panic. The award ceremony that followed was both the most honor Jake had ever received and the most terrifying experience of his life. The Crystallized Music Award apparently came with a formal declaration that Jake Morrison was now an official, cultural bridge ambassador, between human transport workers and alien high society, a position that existed primarily because Valeria had just invented it. "But I'm not actually a Morrison clan representative," Jake protested quietly as they accepted the award. "I'm just a cargo pilot who got lost." "You are now," Valeria murmured back. "House Obsidian formally recognizes your status as a legitimate cultural liaison. Congratulations, you've been promoted from party crasher to diplomatic personnel." The plant bride approached them during the post-ceremony reception, her bioluminescent flowers creating patterns of gentle approval. "Your performance was enlightening," she said in her voice like wine through growing things. The willingness to appear vulnerable while learning something new showed great courage. It embodied the spirit of unity we celebrated today. The crystalline groom added his harmonic agreement. The Morrison Nightshade collaboration demonstrated that strength comes not from perfect knowledge, but from honest effort. This will be remembered. As the evening continued, Jake found himself swept into conversations with alien dignitaries who seemed genuinely interested in his perspective as someone who just experienced interspecies formal culture for the first time. His honest reactions to everything from the gravitational dancing to the multidimensional music apparently provided insights that seasoned diplomats found valuable. "Your species' approach to uncertainty is fascinating," observed a gaseous being whose formal designation translated to something like curator of atmospheric philosophies. "Most civilizations respond to unfamiliar situations with either aggression or withdrawal. Humans seem inclined toward adaptive bumbling." "Adaptive bumbling," Jake repeated. "That's probably the most accurate description of human exploration policy I've ever heard." Valeria remained at his side throughout the interactions, occasionally translating cultural nuances or redirecting conversations when they moved into territory that might expose Jake's limited knowledge of interstellar politics. Her presence lent credibility to his improvised role while providing him with a safety net of genuinely expert diplomatic knowledge. "You're enjoying this," she observed during a brief lull between introduction sessions. "I'm terrified and completely out of my depth," Jake replied. "But, yes. I'm enjoying it. These people are incredible. Their technology, their art, their perspectives on everything from music to mathematics. I never imagined aliens could be so interesting. Most humans don't get this kind of exposure to alien high culture. Your transport work keeps you in commercial zones where interaction is limited to business transactions." "Exactly. I knew aliens existed, obviously, but I never thought about them as individuals with their own personalities and interests and, well, sense of humor. Some of these beings are genuinely funny. The galaxy is full of interesting people," Valeria said with a smile that was becoming less predatory and more genuinely warm. "Most humans never discover that because they're too busy being suspicious of differences to appreciate them." As the reception began winding down, Jake realized that his accidental adventure was approaching its conclusion. The security protocols that had trapped him in the ceremony would release when the event officially ended, allowing him to return to his ship and resume his normal life of hauling cargo between commercial stations. The prospect should have been relief, but instead it felt like losing something valuable he'd only just discovered. "Valeria," he said as they watched the final dancing performances, When this is over, I go back to being a transport pilot and you return to, whatever it is sanguinary aristocrats do when they're not attending weddings. House business. Political negotiations. Social obligations that span decades. She paused, studying his expression. Why? I was wondering, that is, would it be possible, could I see you again? Not as the Morrison representative or cultural bridge ambassador or whatever title we invented tonight. Just as Jake Morrison, cargo pilot who's discovered that the galaxy is much more interesting than he realized. Her smile was radiant. Jake Morrison, I thought you'd never ask. As it happens, House Obsidian has been considering expanding our commercial partnerships with human transport services. We're particularly interested in working with pilots who demonstrate cultural sensitivity and adaptability. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you an adventure. Regular transport contracts with alien worlds, exposure to cultures most humans never encounter, and the opportunity to become genuinely qualified for this diplomatic liaison role we've accidentally created for you. Jake looked around the reception hall, where beings from dozens of worlds continued celebrating the unity that the wedding represented. He thought about his normal cargo runs between human commercial stations, his small apartment on a trade station orbiting a star whose name he'd never learned, and his previous assumption that excitement was something that happened to other people. There's one condition, he said. Which is? You have to teach me how to dance properly. If I'm going to be representing human culture at formal alien events, I should probably learn how to do it without nearly causing gravitational anomalies. Valeria's laugh was pure delight. Jake Morrison, it would be my absolute pleasure to teach you proper interspecies ballroom dancing. Fair warning. The advanced techniques involve temporary dimensional shifting and controlled time dilation. Of course they do, Jake said, taking her hand as the final music began. Why would anything about this new life be simple? Because simple adventures are boring, she replied, leading him into one last dance as the wedding celebration reached its glorious, impossible conclusion. And we, my dear human, are just getting started. 6 months later, Jake stood in his new office aboard House Obsidian's diplomatic vessel, reviewing cargo manifests for a trade mission that would take them to 4 different star systems and introduce him to civilizations he'd only read about in transport pilot gossip. His title was officially Cultural Exchange Coordinator, though he privately thought of himself as Professional Alien Wedding Crasher. Valeria entered with 2 cups of something that smelled like cinnamon and starlight, settling into the chair across from his desk with the easy familiarity of someone who'd become both business partner and closest friend. Ready for tomorrow's departure? She asked. Ready to see what happens when I accidentally stumble into the next impossible situation, Jake replied. Though I'm hoping our next adventure involves less public dancing and more straightforward cultural exchange. Where would be the fun in that? Valeria smiled, her canine teeth catching the light. Besides, the Andromedan Art Festival we're attending features competitive gravity sculpture. You'll love it. Jake looked out the viewport at the stars stretching endlessly in all directions, each one representing worlds and peoples and possibilities he was only beginning to understand. His life had become everything he'd never planned and nothing he could have imagined, and he wouldn't trade it for all the routine cargo runs in the galaxy. Competitive gravity sculpture, he mused. Why do I have the feeling I'm about to accidentally become a champion of something I've never heard of? Because that's your specialty, Valeria replied. Succeeding brilliantly at things you have no business attempting. It's become quite legendary in certain diplomatic circles. The stars called to them, bright with promise and possibility, and Jake Morrison, former cargo pilot, accidental wedding crasher, and current cultural exchange coordinator, smiled and began planning his next beautiful disaster.